So today I am delighted to introduce Dr. Lala Ma, Associate Professor in the Department of Economics in the Gatton College of Business and Economics at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Ma is an environmental economist whose work focuses on the valuation of environmental quality. She often assesses these values through the analysis of housing markets and health impacts. Her research includes the impacts of brownfield remediation, the effects of shale gas development on water quality, infant health, and light pollution, and how markets potentially contribute to the inequitable distribution of pollution. Her work has appeared in the Southern Economic Journal, Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, Science, and many others. Today, Dr. Ma will present her work, Environmental Justice, the Economics of Race, Place, and Pollution, co-authored with Spencer Bonzoff and Christopher Timmons, in which they discuss environmental justice research in economics and how economics can help understand causal mechanisms and suggest solutions. Dr. Ma will speak for about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A in which everyone is invited to participate. Please give a warm SFSU welcome to Dr. Lala Ma.
Right. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here and get to talk to everyone about environmental justice. Let me make sure my slides work. Okay, here we go. All right, so I always start off just kind of asking, well, or describing a little bit, what is environmental justice or environmental injustice? So there's an observation in data that disadvantaged groups are disproportionately exposed to environmental nuisances. Disadvantaged is typically defined in terms of race or income, but it doesn't have to be limited to these categories. So there's a large body of literature that documents that there are disparities in exposure to environmental nuisances or pollution by socioeconomic status. And this field of study has generally been termed environmental justice, or EJ. So the EPA uses a definition of environmental justice that focuses on the regulatory process. So here, the first part, so it requires the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulation, policies. So this is really talking about procedural justice, participation. And then it also says that no population is forced to bear a disproportionate share of the negative human health impacts of pollution. So a kind of distributive justice. So environmental justice is a very interdisciplinary field. It includes scholars from a variety of disciplines: sociology, medicine, law, political science, and other fields. So, but today, though, I'm going to talk about environmental justice from an economics perspective. So what I'd like to highlight is that there's some core concepts in economics that can help us explain why we see disproportionate exposure, which I hope to kind of make the point that the why is really important for policymaking. So the plan for my talk today, so I'll give a very brief background of the environmental justice movement, as well as motivate kind of the importance of why we care about EJ. I'll give some evidence about what we know so far in terms of disproportionate exposure. And then I'll spend a lot of time talking about the mechanisms that give rise to inequitable exposure and the implications of those mechanisms for policy. So a lot of this discussion, as mentioned previously, will be based on work that I have with my co-authors, Spencer Bonzoff and Chris Timmons. And then I'll kind of end with some discussion about the relevance of environmental justice to more current issues. So first, I'll give an example from my own work about how policy targeting pollution overall might actually have disproportionate effects, and this will be in the context of flood risk and flood risk exposure. And then I'll end with some discussion about the role of environmental justice in terms of the impacts of shock, so namely the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, the birth of the environmental justice movement is often attributed to the Warren County protests in North Carolina. In 1978, 31,000 gallons of PCB were illegally dumped along 14 counties in North Carolina. So PCB exposure is bad for health. Exposure can cause liver damage, skin conditions, cognitive failure in children. And so the state collected this polluted soil and identified 2 landfill locations to put the stuff. One was in Warren County and the other one was in Chatham County in North Carolina. So Warren County was deemed not scientifically suitable, and this was because it had a shallow water table and nearby residents relied on local wells as a water source. It was, however, predominantly African American, with a significant share of the population being below the poverty line. Chatham County, on the other hand, was 27% non-white, with only 6% below the poverty line. And importantly, it was publicly owned. And so what that meant is that the residents had could really participate in the decision of whether to site the landfill there. Ultimately, and kind of unsurprisingly, the landfill was sited in Warren County. This decision drew widespread protests, leading to lots of arrests, and gained a lot of national attention, raising awareness about environmental issues for minorities. So fast forward to kind of today, this figure is a visual example of some of the evidence behind disproportionate exposure in North Carolina. So here it plots the fraction of non-Hispanic white in the year 2010 against the amount of pollution emitted from large polluters identified in a national database known as the Toxic Release Inventory. And so here the circles denote where the facilities are. The larger the circle, the larger quantity of pollution. Darker areas represent areas of higher shares of non-Hispanic white. So from a very quick glance, you can see a very striking kind of correlation between where the circles are, the sizes of those circles, and where the lighter colored areas are in the map, which are the locations where there are higher shares of minority populations. We can also look at the correlation between income and pollution. So here, darker areas will represent areas with higher per capita income. And it would initially seem that polluters are actually located in higher income areas, which shouldn't be surprising to all of you economists in the room, because areas with a lot of pollution also have a lot of economic activity. But if we just zoom into a particular area within the state, so here in a certain county, we can see that facilities are disproportionately located in the lower income counties lower income communities within that county. Okay, again, demonstrating this correlation between pollution and income. So why do we care about all of this? Ultimately, we argue that we care about EJ because inequitable pollution exposure might actually lead to inequitable outcomes in health and other measures of well-being. So there's a large literature in both epidemiology and economics that documents gaps in health and wages by socioeconomic status. So here's an example from the CDC. This shows the percent of children aged 1 through 5 with elevated levels of lead in their blood, so high blood lead levels. And it shows this for different racial groups over time. And so overall, we see that the levels, blood lead levels have decreased over time. But it's kind of striking to find that the share of African-American children with elevated blood lead levels, so this would be this kind of lighter blue bar, they're all blue, but the second to lightest bar here, that the share of African-American children with elevated blood lead levels is 2 to 3 times higher than white children, no matter kind of what time period you look at. And so this begs the question of whether unequal exposure to pollution could explain some of these gaps in health in this case. So the environment and health economics literature suggests that there's a high potential for this. So economists have used kind of interesting strategies and kind of cool strategies to try to get at the causal impact of pollution on health. So they've done this using designs to try to separate the independent effect of pollution on health from other determinants of health that are also correlated with pollution. And this work generally finds that things like poor air quality and proximity to hazardous waste sites, and like Superfund sites negatively impact health, and this has been particularly well documented for infants and children. So if we combine this kind of body of evidence with the body of evidence documenting inequitable pollution exposure, this provides at least some indirect support as pollution being a source of inequitable health outcomes and other measures of well-being. Okay, so one other point is that the impacts on children are particularly concerning, okay, because this could potentially have really long-term consequences. Poor children often grow up to become poor adults, and there's even direct evidence showing that pollution exposure during childhood affects later life outcomes. And so EJ concerns potentially reinforces poverty by perpetuating poverty traps. So the Warren County protests that sparked the EJ movement led to a large body of academic work to try to systematically document disproportionate exposure of minorities to pollution. A well-known report, kind of a landmark report, this was in 1987, this was titled Toxic Waste and Race in the US. And so this was one of the first reports that showed that exposure, that really documented the exposure of people of color to toxic waste, or the disproportionate exposure. So an example of one of their kind of landmark results, the average percent of people of color in zip codes containing at least one commercial hazardous waste site, waste facility was 2 times that of zip codes containing none, okay? So a lot of the early work was really focused on trying to figure out whether this issue in Warren County was more systemic. Okay, and so early work to try to identify inequitable exposure did, however, meet with some it met some pushback due to methodological issues, and these issues basically caused it so that so the evidence across different studies were somewhat inconsistent. So some of the inconsistencies was thought to be due to differences in things like the source of risk or the toxicity of the different hazards that were used. So in terms of the source of risk, are you looking at cancer risk or infection risk? The latency periods will be very different. Studies also differed in terms of the statistical controls that they included. So some models controlled for differences in occupations of the populations near and not near pollution, and while others didn't. And then one big issue was that studies really differed on the level or the unit of analysis that was used, or level of data that's used. And this potentially led to something called an ecological fallacy, or more generally, what we might refer to as aggregation bias. So backing up a little bit, so why is this an issue? So identifying disproportionate exposure really basically boils down to comparing a community that's exposed to pollution with a community that's not. And studies have used different definition of what a community is. So this could be like a state, a city, a county, census tract, census block groups. So part of this decision is usually driven by data availability. And there's an important trade-off here. So using larger communities usually meant that it's more feasible to collect a lot of data on different locations. The benefit of this is that your study is going to have large external validity, okay? The problem, though, is when you're using larger community definitions, what you're trying to do is draw conclusions about individual level behavior from group level analysis, and this could potentially lead to aggregation bias. And that's best demonstrated using this figure here. So here, pollution sources are denoted by these yellow triangles, these small triangles. Each small square represents a neighborhood, okay? Shaded squares are predominantly occupied by people of color, so these guys here, and then white squares are predominantly white. So if we focus on the figure on the left over here, okay, there are a total of 16 neighborhoods. At the individual neighborhood level, pollution is perfectly correlated with minority neighborhoods, okay? So we then infer, okay, there is disproportionate exposure to pollution. Suppose, however, we estimate the same relationship, but use larger units of geography that aggregate these individual neighborhoods to neighborhoods based on these dark bolded lines on the right. Okay, so right here. So instead of 16 neighborhoods now, we have 4. And so at this more aggregated level, white and minority neighborhoods are actually equally exposed to pollution sources. And then we'd kind of falsely conclude that there's no correlation between race and pollution at all. Okay. So recent advances in data availability and computing has actually helped a lot with this. So it's allowed studies to employ really cool, high quality data at the individual level for people, and also pollution data at really high frequencies. So even with these updates in data and computing, overall findings still support that low income and minority households have greater exposure to environmental hazards. So for example, that landmark study on toxic waste and race was redone in 2007, and the authors still found significant racial and socioeconomic disparities with respect to the distribution of toxic waste sites. So all of this work to try to document inequitable pollution exposure eventually led to some response from the government. So in 1992, the EPA published a report on environmental equity, and this created the Office of Environmental Justice within the EPA. This was notable because it was the first report recognizing EJ issues by a federal agency. Then in 1994, environmental justice was formally incorporated into regulatory objectives with Executive Order 12898. So what this did was require all federal agencies to take into consideration EJ concerns when they're making decisions. So the EJ literature has documented inequitable exposure as kind of the stylized fact. Okay, so it exists. And correlations are really important for identifying the existence of environmental injustices. And this was also really important to get EJ issues kind of to receive federal recognition. However, cross-sectional correlations are really limited in the information they provide. So here, for example, they don't distinguish between whether these correlations that we see are a result of polluting firms kind of moving into disadvantaged areas, or given how pollution is distributed across the landscape, disadvantaged groups kind of moved into these areas because land there is cheap. And so this is the well-known chicken and the egg debate in the literature. So we generally argue that we kind of need to move beyond these correlations to understand how EJ arises if we want to actually address this with policies. And so next, I'll kind of talk more about some of these mechanisms behind these EJ correlations. So first, we might see inequitable pollution exposure because polluting firms choose to locate their operations in poor or minority neighborhoods. So they might do so for a variety of different reasons. They could have discriminatory preferences. So citing pollution in a disadvantaged neighborhood is directly factored into a firm's objective function, okay, aside from profit maximization. Or it could also be due to local economic conditions. So areas, for example, with a high share of disadvantaged population would have low cost of land, low cost of labor, and better access to transportation networks. So in this case, a firm locating their operations in a disadvantaged area is actually consistent with firm objectives to maximize profit. I should note that, some of this, while not, directly discriminatory, may be kind of indirectly tied to discrimination. For example, areas that have better access to transportation route could have been, better transportation routes or access could have been a result of historical siting practices that were discriminatory. So think about where highways were located, right? And how that decision was made. So finally, firms could also be steered towards disadvantaged areas due to zoning and permitting regulations set by regulatory agencies. So what does the empirical work have to say about all this? So generally, firms do indeed, or it's been found that firms do indeed site in areas with a high share of minorities at the time when the siting decision is made. However, it seems to be mostly driven by local economic conditions, okay? So the next explanation is something called household sorting. And this is an application of a well-known economic model called the Tibu model of residential sorting. So the idea here generally is that pollution is something we don't like. So this reduces demand for housing. As a result, housing prices are going to be low in these areas with lots of pollution. And so this lowers the cost of living. Since minorities on average have lower income than their white counterparts, minority households will tend to live in these more polluted areas to make that trade-off, leading to the observed EJ correlations that we see in data. So to the extent that the sorting is explaining why we see these correlations in EJ correlations, it implies that people are kind of just doing the best they can, okay, given their resources. And this kind of pushes the source of injustice back to income inequality more broadly. So it's not necessarily just a pollution issue. So there's a growing body of work that's trying to examine whether this is the case. The general strategy is to kind of look at how populations change over time after a polluting source is cited in an area, or if it's like removed, relative to some comparison community that didn't experience that change in pollution. However, the kind of empirical evidence to look at this has been a little bit mixed. Part of the reason is we think is kind of a data issue is again, so it's really difficult to use aggregate data to figure out how individuals change their choice of neighborhoods in response to pollution changes. In other words, rather than following how a neighborhood changed over time and how pollution in that neighborhood changed, we really need to kind of follow people over time to see how their exposure to pollution changed, because people can move. There are also some additional considerations that really complicate measurement of sorting and the sorting story. So sorting assumes first that people are making free choices given their, constraints, resource constraints. But what if those choices are not so free, for example, due to something like housing market discrimination? So recent work has documented that minority residents are more likely to be steered towards polluted neighborhoods and other neighborhoods that are less desirable in other ways when in the process of their housing search. And then there are some dynamics that could complicate this as well. So feedback effects such as gentrification and stigma could also kind of mess up this measurement of this phenomenon. So for example, suppose an area is initially polluted, households are moving and sorting based on this pollution, and then this area is cleaned up. So if people still kind of believe this area is polluted, so kind of an information issue, or if there's like stigma still associated with this area, then that initial sorting on pollution won't be undone, even if the pollution is cleaned. And so then a researcher coming in to measure sorting would basically fail to find evidence of any sorting in this case. And then so we talked about citing by firms, sorting by household. Somewhere in between the citing and sorting is the idea that EJ correlations are coming out of negotiations from the two sides. And this is through a process known as cohesion bargaining. So the Coase theorem basically says that if there are no transaction costs, no income effects, if property rights are well established, lots of ifs and important assumptions. But if those are true, then the most efficient allocation the most efficient economic activity will occur through these negotiations and market transactions. So let's apply this to think about EJ. So if residents are kind of compensated in some way for the risks they bear, then a polluter, knowing that, will try to locate in an area where it needs to pay the least in terms of compensation, right? So now there's an incentive to locate in an area where either there's nobody living there, or in a place where residents are willing to accept low compensation to be exposed to nuisances, to environmental nuisances. If those that are willing to accept lower compensation are also low income and minority, then this again gives rise to the EJ correlations that we see. So there are a couple of implications of this if inequality is coming from these cohesion bargains. So first, like sorting, it suggests at least part of the story is due to income inequality. So firms are just targeting areas with the lowest willingness to pay. However, one should also think about reasons aside from income why minorities might exhibit low willingness to pay. For example, might there be information issues or language barriers that make negotiations very difficult? So this ends up being kind of, what if some of those assumptions fail? Like there's higher transaction costs for certain groups to negotiate. And then related to the above, usually the group that has the property rights to environment will be in a better position to negotiate. However, it's possible that certain disadvantaged groups who have the right to a clean environment might not be able to assert or claim those rights. Okay, so there's evidence of some of these issues at work. So first, there was the famous Searle report. It was a case study. In 1984, the Waste Management Board of California commissioned a consulting firm to write a report to think about what are the considerations of locating waste to energy plants. And so the report basically defined characteristics of communities that were least likely to resist these plants. And so the characteristics were like communities that were heavy industry, rural, looking for economic benefits, had low education. So essentially advising companies to target areas that were not very good bargainers, not very good negotiations. And a lot of this, and it wasn't necessarily related to the actual risk, environmental risk posed. So a more recent study that uses data to kind of look at this more systematically examines kind of negotiations in the context of oil and gas leases. So in this case, these are contracts between landowners and oil and gas companies to allow the company to drill on the homeowner's property. And so what they found was that the quality of the negotiated leases. So what do I mean by quality here? So how likely a lease is to include a clause that protected the environment, environmental quality of the land, the royalties paid, and things of that nature. So they found that the quality of the leases differed based on demographic characteristics. So negotiated lease terms were, on average, worse for Black and Hispanic communities with high Black and Hispanic populations, and also for those who didn't speak English as a first language, so areas where there are higher shares of these groups. Importantly, this was true after controlling for income, which is our measure of willingness to pay. So there were criteria other than how much people valued environmental quality that was determining the outcomes of these leases or these bargains, suggesting that there are potential inefficiencies that's contributing to kind of disproportionate exposure to kind of bad lease terms in this case. Finally, governments can also affect the distribution of pollution. So regulators, policymakers have to allocate regulation and remediation efforts across different nuisances and locations where there's pollution, and they have limited time and resources. So various things can influence how they prioritize their workload. So this could be things like technical factors, how damaging a hazard is, polluter's characteristics. So if a polluter has a particularly bad violation history. And then it can also be based on interest groups that are really good at kind of influencing the regulatory process. And so with respect to this last point, if regulation is applied based on who has the most influence, for example, in areas where people have higher willingness and ability to pay to reduce pollution, and to places that have better ability to organize, then again, regulation can be allocated in a way that creates inequality in pollution exposure. So there's evidence that regulatory actions are correlated with measures of political power. So empirical work has found that, for example, enforcement of environmental regulation is less likely in poorer communities, and also in areas with higher potential for collective action. There's also some evidence that there are less stringent cleanup standards applied to these areas. More recently, actually, evidence has kind of found that policies have improved inequality and pollution exposure. So one recent paper found that the Clean Air Act actually accounted for over 60% of the decrease in gap in PM 2.5 exposure between Black and white communities. And another recent paper found that California's carbon market narrowed the gap in PM and NOx by 6 to 10% annually. Okay, so I talked about various mechanisms. EJ issues likely arise from a combination of these different explanations. So they could be citing, sorting, bargaining between two sides, and then political economy and regulatory issues. Understanding the weight that each of these explanations holds is really an empirical question, and it's really important for crafting policy. So for example, if firm citing is a reason we see inequitable exposure, then policy should really focus on trying to regulate firm location decisions through permitting or zoning. If correlations are coming out of household moving or sorting towards pollution, given their income or resource constraints, then this suggests we really need to address income inequality more broadly. And it's a question about whether, this is the environmental policy is the right type of policy to try to use to deal with these issues. For correlations that are coming out of negotiations between polluters and households, it's also related to income inequality. But in this case, we'd also want to make sure that disadvantaged groups can bargain effectively. So, for example, these groups, it'd be important to ensure that these groups have access to legal expertise and have full information when they're making their choices. Okay, for example, what is near the house that they're potentially moving into? So underlying these different kind of pathways that give rise to inequitable pollution is the housing market, which is closely related. So I work a lot with the housing market in my own research. And so this is part of why I kind of gave rise to some of this interest in environmental justice issues. So housing markets in this case are linking together the quality of a neighborhood and people. Okay, so this plays an important role in environmental justice. So we can see this using something called the EJ pyramid of neighborhood change. It's created by my co-author Spencer Banzap and his co-author Eleanor McCormick. And this really helps, I think, for me at least, visualize how disproportionate exposure can arise through the housing market. So let me describe this a little bit first. So each vertex here represents a feature of a neighborhood. Each line segment connecting the vertices represents a correlation between two features. And then if we have an arrow, additionally, that represents a causal relationship, okay? And so EJ correlations can happen, can materialize because demographic characteristics are an input into where pollution occurs. So kind of that arrow linking next to the correlation too. So this would be the citing story, okay? Or all of this could be because pollution affects housing prices and individuals are trading off between housing costs to accept more pollution, leading to that correlation that we see in line segment 2. We can also use this figure to show why it's important to get the underlying mechanisms right. So here, suppose a policy comes in and tries to clean up the pollution in this neighborhood in an effort to alleviate inequitable pollution burden, okay? And suppose that most of the reason we see inequity in pollution is due to sorting. So in this case, when you clean up the pollution in this neighborhood, the neighborhood becomes more desirable. That drives up housing prices. Now the original residents in the neighborhood are forced to pay higher prices, and it's possible that the benefit they got from this improved environmental quality is not large enough to compensate them for that hike in housing costs. In this case, market effects actually cause this benevolent policy to improve environmental quality to exacerbate the situation and hurt the people the policy was actually trying to help in the first place. Okay, so it's nice, I think, this pyramid to help us see some of these dynamics. So those are some of the mechanisms behind environmental justice correlations. Next, I want to move on and talk a little bit about policies and make the point that policies that aren't actually aimed to address inequality could still potentially have an important effect on equity. So this is going to be in the context of flooding and flood risk. So flooding, as you all know, is a very important issue in the US and worldwide. According to the World Resources Institute, in 2019, floods caused $45.9 billion in economic losses and nearly 4,500 deaths. Future losses are also expected to greatly increase with climate change. And so mitigating flood losses is a really important component of adaptation. So there are different policies to try to address flood risk, but one that's received a lot of attention is reforming the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP. So here, for NFIP, homeowners can purchase flood insurance when they're living in a floodplain through this program. And built into this program are key discounts for certain types of homes and floodplains. Policymakers have considered removing some of these discounts in flood insurance premiums to disincentivize people from living in these flood-prone areas. So what these reforms are basically going to do is raise the cost of living in a floodplain. So if flood risk exposure is different depending on socioeconomic status, because we think flood risk is another kind of environmental nuisance, then reforms might actually have important equity consequences as well. There's empirical evidence that what I just said was true. So here, this figure looks at Houston. It plots the average share of minorities and low-income households within a census tract against the percent of that census tract that's in a floodplain. Okay, we see this clear kind of positive correlation between flood risk and socioeconomic status. So as flood risk increases, so does the percent Black and Hispanic in share of low-income households. We can additionally add median rents to this figure, median rent in the tract, to see that high flood risk areas also coincide with areas of low rents. Okay, so if flood and climate related policy reforms are changing the cost of living in these flood prone areas, then housing markets, again, will be a really important part of the story, mediating the potential impacts. And so in some work with my co-author, Laura Backinson at the University of Arizona, we ask, well, if these flood insurance reforms take place, what are some of these distributional impacts? So what we do is we take housing sales data and flood risk maps in Florida and estimate how much people are willing to pay to avoid flood risk, and how that willingness to pay differs by race, ethnicity, and income. We do this using a model of housing choice, or residential sorting model. And what this does is this gives us a measure of the tendencies that different groups are willing to move into areas with different amounts of flood risk for different amounts of money, of course, given the current price of living in those areas. What we then do is we flip the question around. We take our estimates of those tendencies as given and ask, well, how are people then impacted if we change the price of living in the flooded areas by removing the insurance subsidies? Okay, what we find is that all people dislike flood risk. However, willingness to pay to avoid flood risk is lower for low-income and minority residents. Why is this? Well, there are different mechanisms that could be driving these results. It could be that different groups have different preferences, but it could also be because different groups have different access to information or different beliefs about risks of flooding. And then it could also be due to something like housing discrimination. Our model can't really disentangle these various mechanisms within sorting that lead to differential sorting, but we can still think about how a counterfactual policy would impact everyone if we assume that whatever's driving that sorting is kind of persistent. Okay, so what do we do here? We remove the subsidies from the flood insurance. So now it makes it more expensive to live in a floodplain, so people lose. And what we do is we ask, how much do we have to compensate these people to make them as well off as before we remove those subsidies? Okay, this might sound familiar to you looking at valuation now, I hear in your class. This would be the compensating variation. Okay, so this is the amount that people would lose from the policy. So we plot this dollar value of loss as a percent of income here. We do this for 5 different income groups, ordered from the lowest income to the highest income. These are quintiles of the income distribution. When we also do this by racial group, race and ethnicity. We see that the size of the loss actually falls as income increases as a percent. So this actually means a policy is regressive, placing higher burden on lower income groups. We also see that within an income bin, so holding kind of like holding income fixed, the loss is actually largest for minority groups. So that's the purple and the turquoise bars relative to the yellow bars. And this is true for every category of income. So in this case, flood insurance reform, while intending to mitigate flood risk overall for everyone in the long run, it can have negative distributional consequences, burning the most vulnerable groups the most. And if we think about differences in ability to adapt to disasters, this might not be a very desirable policy outcome. And so finally, let me kind of end by talking a little bit about relevance of EJ to another recent kind of shock and disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic. So shocks and disasters that arguably don't discriminate can have inequitable impacts. And these impacts can be made worse by disproportionate pollution exposure. So here are just some recent headlines from the media that highlight this. The CDC finds that compared to whites, the age-adjusted mortality rates are about 5 times higher for American Indian, Alaskan Native persons, and also non-Hispanic Black populations. And this is about 4 times higher for Hispanic and Latino populations. So there are various reasons why people of color and low-income populations might be at higher risk to COVID-19. The CDC highlights several of these reasons, and I list some here that's had some recent empirical support. So these groups potentially have worse living conditions and be at higher risk of eviction and utility shutoffs. So this makes it more difficult to kind of mitigate infection risk. Similarly, these groups might rely more on things like public transportation and work in essential services, right? There might be underlying differences in chronic health conditions that can also cause these groups to be more at risk. So while the pandemic is not directly tied to pollution and environmental quality, I talk about this a little bit because existing disproportionate exposure to pollution is likely to exacerbate the inequitable impacts of the pandemic. So pollution exposure, inequitable pollution exposure contributes to differences across background health conditions. Okay, and so this creates differences in baseline infection rates by socioeconomic status. Also, in EJ communities, there are often multiple nuisances affecting living conditions. So another term for this is their kind of cumulative impacts, and not just one bad pollutant. And so these areas with more pollution also have worse housing quality, and so it's more crowded, making it harder to socially distance. And for example, they could be farther away from grocery stores, so coincide with food deserts, which make it so that people have to travel farther distances to access nutritious food. Importantly, a lot of these causes or mechanisms that I talked about potentially also contribute to the spread of epidemics, and also for the ability for public policy to kind of control the spread. So language barriers, for example, that prevent efficient cogent bargains may also prevent certain groups from receiving proper care or access to vaccines. Sorting and income inequality more generally could affect the ability for people to kind of take proper health precautions. So for example, if you're worried about losing your job or you don't have paid sick leave, you're going to be less likely to stay home if you're sick. Okay, and this is going to be also problematic for public policy to control the spread of epidemics. So where does this kind of leave us now, and how should we kind of move forward? So to kind of sum up a little bit, the evidence is pretty clear that disproportionate exposure exists. The question of why is still somewhat unclear. So specifically, what I think we need is to have more empirical evidence about the contributions of the various mechanisms that give rise to inequitable pollution exposure, because crafting effective policy is going to really require understanding these causes, right? So, and then second, we see inequity in various other measures of well-being. So like health, educational outcomes, wages. So going forward, it'd also be useful to quantify the extent to which unequal exposure to pollution contributes to these other disparities. So I think there's, the literature has found a link for sure, but there's still, I think, a lot of uncertainty regarding the magnitudes of these things. Okay, so I think economics has a lot to add here, given its theories about firm behavior and household choice. As well, economics has a lot of empirical methods that can contribute to this, the study of environmental justice, because using kind of methods to identify causal relationships, okay, beyond simply correlations. So until we can kind of figure out some of the causes of these pollution gaps that we see, disasters such as flooding and climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic will continue to have kind of this disproportionate effect on the most disadvantaged groups of our community. So that's all I have for today for the slide portion, and I would love to hear your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you so much. Let's everybody just sort of give a round of applause, and I don't know, these little reactions here you have in Zoom there, the little emoticons, and yeah, that was really fantastic. I learned so much. Yeah, you've really laid down like basically, I don't know, the foundation of what I know about environmental justice. Like as an economist, I was really wanting to understand, like, well, what can I do as an economist? How can I even start thinking about it? And you just answered that question in spades. So, and we really appreciate it. So yeah,
I realized I'm a little bit over time. I didn't realize I should have told me to stop talking.
No, that's a fine.
I apologize for that.
I actually have a 3-hour class slot.
Oh, okay.
But no, but so we're okay. But we're not. Don't worry. We will stop for now. But as far as the lecture portion of this class goes, so what I thought I would do first is I'm just gonna. Of course, my students, you all need to stay on because I'll be at some point calling on you randomly to ask questions. But I thought that maybe, first of all, we'll just kind of open the floor and we'll go with whatever questions people have on their mind. And I would ask, I'm a little slow sometimes when I'm facilitating, trying to like read chat. So just unmute your mic and ask a question. How about we do that? And if you want to raise a hand, I'll try to keep track of that too. But if anybody has a question, just unmute and go ahead and put it out there.
So I wondered if I could ask a question. I'm not an economist, I have to admit, first of all, but sort of, does it seem like, like environmental pollution might kind of interact with people's resistance to COVID-19 or other respiratory disease? Does your study give any direct information on that? And the other thing is, I think you explained what a Cosian something was. But I wondered if you could say that again for the non-economist.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, could you just repeat that first question again? I cut out for just 1 second in the feed.
Sort of, do you think you could draw a direct kind of causal arrow from environmental pollution to respiratory deficit, such as, increased incidence of asthma and things like that, and then to the incidence and severity of COVID?
I see. Yeah. So so let me take the first question first. So there's definitely a lot of evidence that shows the causal effect of like air pollution on respiratory outcomes or diseases. there's been a lot of work relating to COVID in the recent years, as you can imagine. And so I'm not 100% caught up on this literature. But I think, this is certainly, if someone has not done this already, it's something that people will, something that will come up in the future. I think part of this is if we know that if your baseline kind of risk of respiratory issues are higher and you have higher, you've worse outcomes as a result of COVID. And if we know that there's a causal link between air pollution and respiratory issues, you can kind of make those connections. I think the difficulty is actually quantifying that, right? Getting a precise number of like, how much more does this increase your risk to COVID? That's a harder question. And I'm not completely sure about what the literature has to say right now. But I think there are probably a lot of health economists working on this, right? With respect to cohesion bargaining, so basically it's this idea is that even without intervention from regulators, two parties will work and negotiate with each other and lead to kind of a final allocation where everyone is as happy as they can be. And so in other words, the efficiency is maximized. So that's kind of what the Coase theorem says. As long as transaction costs there are no transaction costs and property rights are well defined. And so a lot of the problem here with EJ is kind of like, well, in particular with the transaction costs, if certain groups have higher transaction costs, so for example, it's harder for certain groups to go participate and negotiate with firms, then that could potentially, that violates one of the assumptions of that could lead to an efficient outcome. And so there's a problem, right? And so that's kind of the idea of cohesion bargains here.
Hi, Dr. Ma. I have a question.
Yes, hi.
I'm Colin Weaver. I'm a grad student here at San Francisco State, and I just wanted to make sure I was understanding and like taking away more or less what was going on with the flood insurance. So to recap, so people live in floodplains, which is bad because their houses flood, and then the government has to spend a bunch of money correcting that, basically, and compensating them. Right. And so you went and looked at some policies that would make it more expensive to live in floodplains, which would, in theory, prevent this problem or mitigate it somewhat. But since you specialize in environmental justice, you looked at that a little more comprehensively. And what you found is that really this probably wouldn't solve the problem, or it would just move the problem somewhere else, because the people living in floodplains right now tend to be minorities, tend to not have very much money, and don't really have a better place to go anyway. Is that more or less the right takeaway from your research?
Well, I think I think the takeaway is that, so flood insurance, you're subsidizing people to live in floodplains. And if we don't want people to be flooded, then we really don't want to give people that signal to live there, right? And so in theory, overall, if you think of a policy overall, this could potentially be a good idea because you're incentivizing people to move away. The problem with looking overall is that you ignore the fact that some groups really lose a lot and other groups don't lose that much. And so I think there's potentially a trade-off between equity and efficiency. But if you think of like the longer term impacts of equity, and these groups don't have the insurance, so like the kind of not just like flood insurance, but they don't have savings, they don't have other resources that make them more resilient to the impacts of climate change. At the end of the day, perhaps the cost to society is going to be greater when you think of the long term. And so maybe this isn't so much of an equity efficiency trade-off. So I think the takeaway really is, we want to think about the overall, what we say, net benefits of a policy, whether the policy on net has benefits that are greater than the cost, but we really should also look at how the net benefits are distributed across different groups within society. And here you might see a problem if certain groups are losing a lot, and it's more problematic if over time that same group is losing over and over again.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, Doctor. I have a question regarding steps forward after the fact.
Uh-huh.
So you had talked about all these problems affecting people of more marginalized groups. What would be your step forward legally, socially, politically, economically, is my question.
Yeah, so, that's a good question. That's a broad question. I think my role as an economist is to identify areas, whether it be, maybe like, for example, policies where the effects are disproportionately burdening more marginalized groups, and to present this evidence to policymakers or regulators, and then to leave this then up to regulators and policymakers to make a decision about what to do next. I think my role here as an economist is to, use academic research to kind of document and find some of these issues where, and then present this to potentially people who can actually make a change in policy.
As students, though, do you think there's anything we can do aside, because we don't have the position of power that you do per se, where we can just sort of present stuff to a legal body, so would you think protest in some of these cases, like some of the pipelines which are polluting, people tend to go out and protest against that sort of stuff? Do you think that would be a possible alternative?
So certainly kind of one of the things that empirical evidence has shown is that voter participation matters, right? So that's one way you can reflect, or a resident or a community member can reflect their preferences to people who can make, or regulators who can make that change. I do think, being students of economics, you potentially have some tools that can be put to use. For example, there are lots of nonprofit organizations out there that are looking for people who can kind of do empirical analysis on, the effects of policies on different marginalized groups versus non-marginalized groups. And so there are, I think, lots of ways you can contribute.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see here. I'll sort of cycle in another student here. Let's see here. Fevin, are you ready with your question? Can you unmute and ask your question? Okay, maybe we'll come back to her. How about? Oh, there she is.
I don't have
Okay.
any questions right now, but
Okay. All right. No problem. No problem. Okay. Let's see here. Kayla, how about you? Kayla, can you unmute? And all right, let me go to Donna. Donna Nguyen, how about you? What's your question?
I have no questions at the moment.
Okay. All right. Karen?
During the slides you had mentioned PM 2.5 and then like another just PM. I was wondering what PM stands for and what the difference is.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So PM stands for particulate matter. And the 2.5 is like the radius or the diameter of the particle. And so the smaller the particles, the easier it is to breathe in, and that can cause kind of respiratory issues. So it's an air pollutant. And so
Okay.
actually, if you look on your iPhone or whatever, your Android phone, you can actually, these phones now produce an air quality index based on the PM in the air.
Okay, Colin, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Will do. Thank you. So, Dr. Ma, you touched on it just the end of your talk that, this kind of fits maybe the pattern we see in health, education, and other areas of social interest and, poor, minority communities across the board, crime rates, that sort of thing. And
Yep.
I was wondering, is there anything about environmental justice and pollution that maybe is different from those things? And I realize not everyone, like, you can't be an expert in everything, but in your, surveying of the literature, is there something that stands out about it in terms of maybe, the models or the mechanisms, or is there something maybe about the nature of the historical data that makes it better or more interesting to study, have you found?
So let's see. So I guess one of the differences, well, I don't know if this would be one of the kind of interesting things about pollution is they're often like natural geography, influences from natural geography that gives it variation. So for example, if you're near the ocean, right, and there's lots of wind there, it actually allows the pollution to dissipate more. And so from a pure kind of empirical standpoint, there are opportunities there to actually exploit this kind of what we call random variation due to, wind, that can help us identify causal effects. That's not to say that some of these, there's not other ways to get random variation in other outcomes, but this is one of those very clear kind of sources of random variation that can be useful for identifying causal inference. I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer for, what about EJ I think is more interesting than the other fields. I think they're all intimately related.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How about we go to Elijah Valverde?
Hi, Doctor. I know this question might seem a little elementary. I'm just a freshman at SF State.
Great.
But I was wondering if possible, if you could kind of explain I'm looking at your article here and it was called The Pyramid of Environmental Gentrification. And if you could kind of give a, not a dumbed down, but like a basic way of understanding it, or if you could provide a resource for how to understand it, because I was just a little confused, like following along through it.
The pyramid. So it kind of also what I pulled up in the slides. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, I think it's just a way to think about how different how different features of a neighborhood are all connected. So each point in that pyramid represents an aspect of a neighborhood. So so we had kind of, let's see, pollution is an aspect. Let's see, housing prices was another aspect, right? People were an aspect, right? And then there was, I think, one more point which is called endogenous amenities, basically other things about a neighborhood that define the character of the neighborhood. And so the key is to use that pyramid, I think, which is we should really be talking to my co-author, but use that pyramid to understand how all of these things are related in the context of environmental justice. So the fact that those points are all linked by a line suggests that there are correlations between all of those things. So other amenities are also correlated with pollution. So you're not usually going to see, for example, a polluting facility located in like a really nice neighborhood where schools are really great, there's low crime and other kind of good amenities. communities, right? And so all of those features are linked, so they're correlated, but then it's really important to figure out the causal relationships between each point. So is it the case, and to what extent, if you improve pollution, will that positively impact prices, and if so, by how much? And then does that then change the character of the neighborhood, either because people are moving, or people are moving and their preferences change, and this causes kind of other types of businesses to move in, that then goes back and affects prices again. So I kind of gave an example when I was talking about how, you know, housing markets can mediate, you know, a change in the neighborhood, like pollution change. But in reality, a lot of these kind of there's a lot of feedback in a lot of these relationships, and that's when things get a little bit more complicated, but also interesting and difficult, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was a lot to take in, looking at that pyramid. It's a very cool way to summarize the data or visualize it. And there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I definitely think there are many ways to you know, many ways to use that pyramid. And I think, and I only gave one example to show how a correlation could be a result of two different causal mechanisms.
Yeah.
But there are other ways to think about, other things to consider, like feedback effects. So you could potentially map out gentrification in this pyramid as well, right? Which involves multiple loops in the pyramid. So I think it's a very, I mean, I didn't create it, but I think it's a really interesting kind of figure, a teaching tool.
Cool. Okay, well, let's see here. Looks like Fevin has her hand up, so we'll go with Fevin, and then I'll call on Amal. Maybe you can ask a question. So go ahead, Fevin.
I just wanted, like, earlier on the slides, you mentioned that the firms choose this kind of places purposely, like to pollute or to whatever they want to do. They purposely choose this kind of places where a lot of low-income communities or like people, this kind of places anyways. But is there any like governmental police or anything that will hold them like accountable for that, or especially considering the people that are not moving there on purpose for the cheaper prices, considering the people that were there from the beginning? Or yeah,
so I think there are a couple of things in what you're saying. So first, you know, if firms are acting are making illegal decisions, right, then regulators might have to step in, or for example, emitting excess emissions compared to what they're allowed to, then and you're kind of asking, well, do regulators do something about it, enforce rules? What we've seen from the empirical literature is that yes, they enforce rules, but given limited resource and time constraints, the enforcement is different across different communities. That goes back to someone else's question about what can we do? Well, a lot of the differential enforcement is due to kind of participation from the community. And so yes, that can be a problem. And it suggests that, you know, making sure constituents can participate in this process of, you know, in the regulatory process is actually really important. I think the second part of your question is kind of like, well, maybe some individuals aren't moving there because of cheap prices, right? And so then there's a question, well, why do these marginalized groups move there? Is it because of information issues? Are they acting without full information? And so they would have changed their decision had they had the correct information. And so that's a question. I don't know. I think there's some work that suggests that there are differences in access to information across between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged groups, and that could be a reason why people are making the choices they make, aside from just like aside from cost of living, but that remains an area of research, I think.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Hey, Dr. Ma, I have a question. So going back to the beginning, I know you kind of talked about it, but so in 1994, the government finally notices, and then they put a executive order. I was wondering how effective have these policies been in reducing pollution, and what can be done to hold polluters accountable for the harms that they cause to the communities?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So well, holding polluters accountable is kind of a separate thing from that particular executive order. So that one says that any sort of policy making so in the US, we have to, any large policy, we have to conduct a cost benefit analysis. Okay. And so what this executive order is really saying is that when we're considering any policy, we have to think about the distribution of net benefits, aside from just the overall cost versus benefit, overall net benefits. And so this kind of just says that, okay, we have to analyze the distribution the distributional impact of the policy. It doesn't necessarily say that, we have to ensure that, the final decisions of the policies have to be purely for, to target some sort of equitable distribution. And so I think realizing and seeing the distributional effects is a first step. And then actually ensuring an equitable outcome is something that we still need to work on. Part of it is like when you're thinking about, let's say someone is doing something that seems discriminatory. Part of it is, how do you show that it was discriminatory? That's going to be a very difficult thing to do. So yeah, so I think the executive order was really aimed to kind of make policymakers consider the distributional effects to actually achieve it. We're still a little bit, I think there's more to do.
Got it. Thank you so much.
I did notice that you added another slide that we didn't have in the original slides, where it was the Clean Air Act has reduced the particulate matter, the PM counts, right?
Right.
That's some good news, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I think so the and what's interesting is, I mean, the Clean Air Act was in many ways targeting the dirtiest places. And if the dirtiest places are more minority and low income, you are naturally going to get the highest reductions in those areas. So interestingly, this policy did not have a distributional aim in there, and yet it had this positive distributional effect. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Cool.
And with no. I was going to say also, like the cap and trade one too.
Yeah.
It's interesting because with cap and trade, you actually would think that pollution would flow to the dirtiest firms, right? And if the dirtiest firms are located in the most disadvantaged areas, then cap and trade is theoretically, or could potentially, make things worse. In this case, they're looking at a specific time period. I don't recall what the specific time period is, but it seems like in California, it's actually worked to shrink the gap, which is I think interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Oh yeah, no, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we're going to be doing cap and trade in a few classes down the road.
Yeah.
Okay, let me link in. Let's see here. Mizan, did you have a question to ask? Mizan? Okay, go ahead.
No, I'm good. I don't have any questions.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna go. Fevin, did you have another question? I see your hand is up there. I don't know if that's from before.
No, it's just that, just going back to my question, sorry.
Yes,
I
please.
just wanted to ask all this, if these firms are like, are they required to let the people that live around there are they required to inform what they're doing, or is it just they can just do whatever they want, and then it's the responsibility of the communities to educate themselves and try to move out, or whatever decisions they make after finding out? How, I'm just concerned, how do they find out? It's like, let's say like I was born there and I don't know anything, I was just living my life. I'm not moving there after I grew up for cheaper prices. Let's say I was just born there, and by the time I move out to college or anything after 15 years of living there, I'll be exposed for so many things. I'm just, are these firms like required to you know, to let the people know what they're doing, or is it just
Yeah, so for depending on the type of kind of pollution activity, there are permitting processes in place. So if a firm wants to locate in an area, they have to get approval from usually the state regulator, state environmental department agency. And so that is kind of the way that firms are cited. And so, you know, there's they can't just go somewhere and set up shop. So there's a permitting process. A question is, well, what are the things that regulators are considering in permitting? And one of the things that I think increasingly regulators are concerned about is in a location, they're not just looking at the addition of one facility, but they're now paying more attention to, well, you have this additional facility in a community, how burdened is this community already of the existing pollutants? And I believe, and this goes back to something I mentioned during the slides, is on cumulative impacts. And so they kind of, I think are paying, EJ kind of activists are pushing regulators to pay more attention to the cumulative burdens a community has when deciding where to then add an additional facility. And this is particularly in the case of New Jersey, where I think they have a cumulative impacts law, something that's kind of interesting to look into if you've got time. And that's like in the permitting process now. So they have to consider cumulative impacts when deciding where to site a facility, I believe.
I see, okay.
Well, let's see. Does anybody else have any more questions? Let's see here. Kayla, did you want to get in a question? I think her mic was not working. Okay. Well, maybe we should think about letting Dr. Ma go. She's on East Coast.
Yes.
And we have we're definitely grateful for the time that you spent here. So, okay, going, gone. No more questions. Okay, we'll call it a close. So again, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having me. This was a pleasure to get to interact with everyone.
Oh yeah, this is great. And we actually had a nice representation across the campus too. A lot of people tuned in. So, well, thanks so much, and we'll be in touch. And maybe we can get the newest version of your slides.
Yes, I'll send that. I'll
okay.
send that right now. I'll email that to you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Cool. Because students beware, there will be follow-up questions on this. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ma. You have a good evening, and we'll be in touch down the road.
Great. You all too. Bye.
Okay.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Bye. Right. So my students, fantastic. I'm so happy that she came to talk with us. I'm going to stop the recording here. There we go. Okay.